Chapter 6: The Marginalist Revolution in Economics. The so-called marginalist revolution in economics is acclaimed by bourgeois economists as the theoretical revolution, which freed political economy from extraneous political considerations, and so founded modern scientific economics. The orthodox Marxist characterization of the marginalist revolution inverts the bourgeois interpretation. For orthodox Marxism, the marginalist revolution marks the final step in the ideological degeneration of political economy. Bukharin, 1927, Maurice Daub, 1940, 1973, and Ronald Meek, 1973. The marginalist revolution in economics cannot be reduced either to the purely scientific revolution of the bourgeois interpretations or to the purely ideological revolution of its Marxist critics. The pioneers of the marginalist revolution were neither disinterested scientists, nor were they mere apologists for capitalism. The founders of the marginalist revolution certainly posed new scientific questions, which they sought to answer according to the normal canons of scientific procedure. These new questions were not posed in a scientific vacuum, nor were these questions' motivation purely apologetic. These new questions were primarily an attempt to provide rational solutions to the new problems presented to the state by the maturing contradictions of capitalist accumulation, problems presented by the growth of an independent working class movement, by the growing monopolization of capitalism, and by the intensification of the crisis tendencies of accumulation. These were real problems, which could not be resolved by a purely apologetic ideology, but which had to be approached scientifically. The ideological limitations of the new economics were no different from those of classical political economy. These ideological limitations lay not in the apologetic character of the new economics' answers, but in the restricted character of its questions. Like classical political economy, the new economics recognized the deficiencies of actually existing capitalism. But like classical political economy, the new economics did not see these deficiencies of capitalism as being inherent in the social form of capitalist production, but in the gap which separated the mundane reality of capitalism from capitalism's ideal model, a gap which, like political economy, it attributed to human intellectual and moral weakness, which could be remedied by appropriate institutional reform. Marginalist economics was no more and no less ideological than had been classical political economy. The fundamental change lay not in the motivation of its proponents, nor in the scientific status of its procedures, but in the questions which it posed. If the marginalist revolution is not simply an ideological revolution, the orthodox Marxist critique, which reduces marginalist economics to marginalist economics' apologetic function, cannot be regarded as satisfactory. In this chapter, I will explore in more detail the relationship between science and ideology in marginalist economics, in order to establish the continuity underlying the apparently radical break between marginalism and classical political economy. In the next chapter, I will argue that Marx's critique of political economy provides an intrinsic theoretical critique of the ideological limitations of the new science of economics. The Marginalist Revolution. The Marginalist Revolution was pioneered by three writers who initially worked independently of one another, but whose work had many convergent features. They were Jevons in England, Walras in Switzerland, and Menger in Austria. The revolution is conventionally dated at 1870, but its roots go back to the 1860s, and the new methods of economic analysis did not achieve general recognition until the 1880s and 1890s. It is therefore necessary to distinguish between the achievements of particular individuals in pioneering new techniques of analysis on the one hand, and the adoption of the new system of economics based on the application of those techniques on the other. The particular motives of Jevons, Walras, and Menger in developing the new approach did not necessarily coincide with the reasons for its achieving sweeping, if belated, recognition. Thus, the initial problems that Jevons, Walras, and Menger set themselves were apparently rather idiosyncratic and could not immediately be located within a general intellectual movement. On the other hand, the fact that the three thinkers independently raised similar questions and reached very similar conclusions should indicate that their concerns were not as devoid of general significance as might appear at first sight. Of the founding fathers, only Jevons defined his project directly in opposition to classical political economy. Walras worked within the French tradition of a utility theory going back to Say and Smith, while Menger saw his task as one of bringing some rigor into the German tradition of, quote, vulgar economy. Moreover, as we saw in the last chapter, classical political economy was not immediately replaced by the method of marginal analysis. For about 2 decades, the historical and empirical methods were dominant. For the question raised by the marginalist only became central political issues some 20 years after they were first raised by the pioneers. Technically, the marginalist revolution is defined by a new method of economic analysis, which applies the calculus to the problem of determination of prices. The new method of analysis did not involve any substantial technical innovations, for once the question of the determination of prices in the market had been posed as a topic for rigorous investigation of the techniques required for solving the question fell almost immediately to hand. The pioneers all posed the question within the framework of a theory of utility, and this in many ways made their approaches to the question and their solutions extremely cumbersome. However, the essence of the problem and of its solution was relatively straightforward. Thus, the methods of calculus had been applied to economic problems before, by such thinkers as Gosson and Cournot, and to analogous problems by Bernoulli, but the earlier attempts had been ignored, not because of a blindness to genius, but because the questions that were posed did not at the time seem particularly significant. The new methods of analysis arose out of a new concern with the problem of prices. Economists had always sought to explain the determination of prices as part of their enterprise. What the marginalists introduced was an emphasis on the need for a rigorous theory of price determination. For classical political economy, the determination of prices was of a subordinate concern. The central theoretical issues were those of the constitutional order, within which capitalism could best develop to the advantage of the nation as a whole, and of the relations between classes proper to such a development. This led classical political economy to pose questions of distribution within the framework of a theory of growth, within which the rigorous determination of individual prices was of little concern. So long as the determination of prices could be assumed not to conflict too seriously with the theory of distribution. For the marginalist, this order of priorities was inverted, and the central concern became one of developing a rigorous theory of price determination. Within classical political economy, the determination of prices was subordinate to the problem of distribution, and prices were the byproduct of the theory of distribution. Once wages, rent, and the rate of profit had been determined, prices could be derived by adding together the component parts. However, the contradiction between the classical theory of production and the Ricardian theory of distribution meant that the resultant prices did not coincide with the values according to which the distributive categories were determined. Hence, within the Ricardian system, the determination of prices was always subject to qualifications from this divergence necessarily introduced. The vulgar critics of classical political economy had exploited this contradiction to reject the classical theory of distribution and the theory of value on which it was based. However, although they asserted the priority of price over value, or even the exclusive reality of price as against value, they could offer no rigorous theory of price determination, nor did they seriously seek to develop such a theory. The marginalists followed the vulgar economists. The marginalists followed the vulgar economists in their concern with the question of prices. But they did not follow the vulgar economist in rejecting the need for a theory of value. For the marginalists, a theory of value was essential. For the marginalists, a theory of value was essential to any attempt to develop a rigorous theory of price. And the scientific weakness of the classical theory of value was that it could not achieve this. The task the marginalists set themselves was to develop a rigorous theory of price determination on the basis of the subjective theory of value. The basis of the marginalist theory of value was initially defined as, quote, utility. The problem of prices and the problem of reform. In order to understand the marginalist revolution, we have to understand why questions about the rigorous determination of prices came to replace questions about economic growth and distribution as the central concern of economists. An obvious answer is that questions about economic growth and distribution led too easily to socialist conclusions, so that a new apologetic theory was needed. Marginalism neatly avoided the major questions about class relations and the Constitution in order to pose questions about utility, efficiency, and the formation of prices. Thus, the marginalist revolution removed the politics from political economy. Precisely its strength as far as bourgeois economists are concerned. Marginalism thus narrowed the field of economics, made marginalism into marginalism thus narrowed the field of economics, made it into a technical rather than a political discipline, and asked innocuous questions while still providing a naturalistic and rationalist justification for capitalist social relations. In very general terms, such an answer has some validity. However, it will not do as an account of the marginalist revolution. First, as we have already seen, classical political economy has shown itself quite capable of defending capitalism, expressing Burke's dictum that, quote, the laws of commerce are the laws of nature, and consequently the laws of God, end quote. Burke. Its deficiencies were its inability to accommodate the possibility of reforms to deal with the labor question and the increasingly apparent unreality of its fundamental premises. Secondly, the mantle of classical political economy was not immediately taken over by marginalism. Popularizations of economics relied on the relativism of the historical school and on the vague notions of vulgar economy, and continued to borrow ideas from the classical school. The directly apologetic development of marginalism had to wait until the 1890s. It is also very far from being the case that in the last quarter of the 19th century, classical political economy was contrasted with marginalism as political rather than technical. Classical political economy had played a central role in the political conflicts of the first 3 or 4 decades of the century. But from the late 1840s, it had progressively lost its radical veneer. The final break was marked in Britain by the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, and corresponded politically to the development of the Anti-Corn Law League from an organization that sought to contest the privileges of landed property to an organization that sought to preserve the working class from radical influence by persuading the workers of the futility of reform and of their common interest with their employers. On the continent, the break was similarly marked by the class compromise which followed the defeat of 18. Oh, Jesus Christ! On the continent, the break was similarly marked by the class compromise which followed the defeat of the revolutions of 1848. Although the class model of society, in a sense, had radical possibilities inherent within it, and the classical framework was one within the fundamental constitutional and political issues could be raised, these issues were regarded by mid-century as having been definitively settled. Classical political economy, far from providing a framework within which to question capitalism, purported to show definitively and conclusively that liberal capitalism was the best of all possible worlds. Marginalism, by contrast, was born in a period of fundamental political change and matured in debates whose motivation was intensely political. If classical political economy had degenerated by the 1860s, marginalism came upon the public stage in the last 2 decades of the century in a much more militant and aggressive garb, playing a central role in the debates within the emerging labor movement between reformist and revolutionary factions, serving not simply to defend capitalism, but also to show the necessity and the possibility of reforms within the capitalist order. It would be quite wrong to take marginalism at face value and see it merely as a method of technical analysis that is devoid of any particular conception of society. Marginalism embodied a particular theory of capitalist society, no less than did classical political economy. And it is our task in this chapter to disentangle that theory. Although it presented itself as a positive science and insisted on the strict separation of facts from values, in which it followed and was influenced by John Stuart Mill, the evaluative orientation of the new approach to the economy stands out very clearly when we consider just what were the prices to be explained. The marginalists were no more concerned with the determination of the actual prices that ruled on the market than were the classical economists. All the innovators emphasized the abstract character of pure economic theory, in which the invention of chance and uncertainty, of specific historical institutions or political interventions, could all be ignored and their consideration deferred to subordinate empirical and policy studies. Pure theory was not concerned with the determination of actual prices, but with their determination in an ideal world of perfect knowledge, perfect foresight, perfect competition, and pure rationality. It is against this ideal world that the real world and proposed reforms in the real world are to be measured. The questions that gave rise to a demand for a pure theory of price were questions about the proper prices of commodities. Jevons, for example, was especially concerned with the problem of scarcity, in particular the scarcity of coal, and with the role of prices in allocating resources. The problem Jevons posed was that of determining what prices would achieve the optimal allocation of resources. The solutions that were reached would then serve as the basis of policy prescriptions about the proper role of state intervention in the formation of prices in order to achieve such an allocation. This example may seem relatively insignificant, a slender basis on which to build a revolution in economics, as opposed to, say, a branch of public administration. But the question had a much more general significance, and the solution a much more fundamental application. The more general context of the marginalist revolution was a concern with understanding the possibilities and limits of state intervention in the regulation of economic relations, including in particular the resolution of the labor question. The general background of this concern was the increasing role of the state in economic and social life. This role involved not only increasing state provision of public utilities and of limited education, health and welfare services, but also increasing pressure on the state to intervene in the regulation of the private sector, to protect domestic producers against foreign competitors, to intervene abroad to secure foreign markets and investment outlets, to regulate financial markets and to stimulate domestic investment, to regulate the national transport system, and above all to intervene directly or indirectly to regulate the relations between capital and labor. All these actual and proposed forms of state intervention contravene the pure principles of economic liberalism. In order to evaluate them rationally, a more rigorous theory of the consequences of a liberal economic regime are required. Such a theory would then provide a basis on which proposed intervention in the economy could be judged by providing a benchmark against which it could be evaluated. Thus, Menger developed his version of marginalism from a dissatisfaction with the empiricism of the German historical school that was unable to provide any principled basis on which the possibilities and limits of state intervention could be evaluated, while Ra sought to establish rigorously the results of economic liberalism in order to locate its limits. Quote, "How could these economists prove that the results of free competition were beneficial and advantageous if they did not know just what these results were? The fact that economists have often extended the principle of free competition beyond the limits of free competition's true applicability is proof positive that the principle has not been demonstrated." End quote. Ra. Jevons, too, was quite explicit about his motivation. Quote, "If such a thing is possible, we need a new branch of political and statistical science, which shall carefully investigate the limits of the laissez-faire principle and show where we want greater freedom and where less." End quote. Jevons, 1883. The context of the Marginalist Revolution was the rapidly growing movement for social reform. The specific motivation for the development of a rigorous theory of price determination was the concern to be able to achieve some basis on which to evaluate proposed reforms. This concern brought people of very different political persuasions into a common enterprise. Thus, while most of the marginalists were committed to some degree to social reform, some saw the new methods as a means of tempering reformist demands. Menger saw in the new economics a means of setting conservatism on a rigorous foundation by showing the precise mechanisms by which organic social institutions, such as prices and money, emerge from the pursuit of individual self-interest and come to express the collective wisdom of society. Menger therefore lumped together classical political economy and the German historical school as exponents of a one-sided rationalistic liberalism that paid insufficient attention to the value of organic social structures in their enthusiasm for reform. Menger saw himself as bringing to fruition the tradition of Burke and Savigny that the historical school had betrayed in aiming at, quote, full understanding of existing social institutions in general and of organically created institutions in particular, the retention of what had proved its worth against the one-sidedly rationalistic mania for innovation in the field of economy. The object was to prevent the dissolution of the organically developed economy by means of a partially superficial pragmatism, a pragmatism that, contrary to the intention of its representatives, inexorably leads to socialism. End quote. Menger. The Marginalist Theory of Price. The starting point of the marginalist economic analysis is the possession by individuals of goods in conditions of scarcity. The economic activity of these individuals consists in exchanging these goods for other goods in such a way as to maximize the total utility that they derive from them. Thus, the analysis focused on the elementary form of exchange and asks how prices emerge on the basis of such elementary exchanges. The exact terms in which each writer proposed the solution differ, but the essential principles are common to all. Exchange brings together individual owners of goods. When such owners meet in the market, they have to decide which goods to sell and at what price, and which goods to acquire and at what price. It seems self-evident that the price an individual will be prepared to pay for a given good will depend on what she thinks it is worth to her. Yet for the classical political economists, this always gave rise to the paradox that the highest prices are paid for the most worthless goods, such as diamonds, while the most useful goods, such as air, are free. The marginalists solved this paradox by noting that the price did not correspond to the total utility of the good, but to the utility of the last unit of the good that was acquired. The marginalists also observed that as an individual acquired more of a given good, the utility of the marginal unit tended to diminish. Because air is available in unlimited quantities, we are profligate in air's use, so that the utility of the last unit of air used is nil. While because diamonds are very scarce, the marginal utility of diamonds is high. Goods, therefore, only have value in conditions of scarcity, and the task of economics is to establish the value of scarce goods. The price an individual will be prepared to pay for a good will correspond not to the total utility of that good, but to the utility of the marginal unit of the good that is acquired. The individual will take up the opportunity to exchange if by so doing she can achieve an increase in the sum of utilities at her disposal. Faced with given exchange ratios, prices, the individual will choose to exchange goods until the relative marginal utilities of the goods possessed at the end of the transaction correspond to the exchange ratios in which they stand. In any other situation, the individual could improve her position by exchanging goods of relatively low for goods of relatively high marginal utility. Thus, at every possible set of exchange ratios, the demand for and supply of each good on the part of each individual can be specified. If individual demand and supply functions are aggregated, total demand and supply functions can be specified. It can be shown that under appropriate assumptions, including the absence of ignorance, inconsistency, and uncertainty, the interaction of demand and supply will give rise to a unique set of stable equilibrium prices that clear all markets by equalizing supply and demand. These prices are those that correspond to the free and rational choices of all the individual members of society seeking to achieve their own optimal solutions in conditions of scarcity. The analysis so far is based on the interaction of a series of individuals each endowed with a fixed and given supply of goods. The initial allocation of goods is taken as given historically, and so is no matter for the economist to investigate. However, an adequate economic analysis must take account of the fact that goods are produced and so are not in fixed supply. Production is considered to be beyond the area of concern of economics, and is seen as a purely technical process within which factors of production are employed in certain technically determined proportions to produce goods. If there is a range of techniques available to produce a given good, then the economist will be concerned to explain which technique will be employed. But otherwise, the, quote, hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there hangs the notice, no admittance except on business, end quote, Capital Volume 1, is no business of the marginalist. The recognition of the fact that goods are produced does, however, have important implications. If we move from the level of abstraction, at which production is considered to be undertaken by individuals, the introduction of production introduces a distinction between two different kinds of economic units. On the one hand, households, which are the units of consumption. On the other hand, firms, which are the units of production. Households supply the services of productive factors to firms and purchase from firms the goods that are produced with those productive services. For this recognition of production introduces two further distinctions. Firstly, the motivation of firms cannot be identified immediately with the motivation of households. The household's aim is to maximize utility, but utility is a subjective concept, and a firm is not a subject. Thus, the firm seeks to maximize profits. This introduces a complication into the theory that can only be resolved by formulating a theory of profit, which can establish that profit corresponds to the return to the owner of capital, so that the maximization of profit corresponds to the maximization of utility on the part of the owner of capital. Secondly, a distinction is introduced between goods and productive services. The Austrians distinguish between goods of different orders. Productive services differ from the goods, so far considered, in having no utility as such, for they are only useful when they are applied to the production of useful goods. The utility of productive services is therefore a derived utility, as is that of intermediate products that never enter final consumption. The fact that productive services can be said to have a derived utility makes it possible, under certain restrictive conditions, to derive prices of these productive services from the estimations of utility expressed in the prices of final products. If the factors of production are in fixed supply, and if the same factors are used in different combinations in different productive activities, the marginal contribution of each factor to final utility can be derived, and this will correspond in equilibrium to the price of the factor. Thus, wages, rent, and profit can be derived as the revenues accruing to the factors of production, labor, land, and means of production, without making any reference to labor time, or to costs of production. Such a result was gleefully proclaimed by the early Marginalists as a demonstration of the falsity of the classical doctrines. However, their elation was premature, since the assumption of fixed factor supplies, on which the result depended, was either meaningless if it referred to the aggregate supply of each factor, because it could not specify the basis on which heterogeneous qualities of labor, land, and means of production should be aggregated, or grossly unrealistic if it referred to the fixed supply of each quality of labor, land, and means of production taken separately. More sophisticated developments of marginalism recognized the role that cost had to play in the determination of prices by recognizing that factor supplies were not fixed. The price of the factors of production are then determined by the interaction of demand and supply. The demand for each factor will be dependent on its marginal productivity, which is the monetary expression of that factor's marginal contribution to utility. Since factors will be used in the most productive outlets first, the marginal productivity of each factor will decrease as relatively more of that factor is used. Thus, the demand for the factor will be a decreasing function of that factor's price. The supply of each factor can be determined in one of two ways within the marginalist framework. On the one hand, on the basis of a real cost theory, such as that of Alfred Marshall and of the classical tradition, the supply of a factor of production will be dependent on the marginal disutility incurred in offering it for sale. For the laborer, this is the marginal disutility incurred in having to work rather than enjoy the time at leisure. For the capitalist, it is the marginal disutility involved in abstaining from immediate consumption in favor of consumption in the future. On the other hand, on the basis of a theory of opportunity cost, such as the Austrian theory of utility cost, the supply of the factor of production will be dependent on the utility that could be gained by employing the marginal unit of the factor elsewhere. In the end, the two theories come to much the same thing, although the opportunity cost theory is marginally less tendentious in being less reliant on the direct subjective estimation of utilities. All that matters is that either version can establish that in equilibrium, the price of the factor of production corresponds to that factor of production's marginal utility on the one hand, and its utility cost or marginal disutility on the other. Moreover, it can be shown that the sum of wages, rent, and profit derived in this way, subject to certain not unrealistic conditions, will exhaust the total product. Thus, the marginalist analysis of prices can give rise to a theory of distribution, given the initial distribution of resources, by explaining the returns to the various factors of production. The marginalist analysis of the pricing of products and of productive services is conducted at a level of abstraction that excludes consideration of a historically specific framework of social relations. However, the proper realization of the principles of economic rationality does require the institutional separation of households from productive enterprises as budgetary units, the existence of a free market in both products and factors of production as a means by which individual evaluations of utility can be related to one another, and the freedom and security of property as the basis of free exchange. Within this framework, the prices that arise are then the results of the spontaneous and unconstrained expression of individual rationality. Since the institutions of production and exchange are simply technical instruments by means of which individuals may rationally pursue their economic ends, it should not be surprising that the marginalist analysis offers not simply an abstract account of the formation of prices in conditions of perfect competition, but also purports to establish the social rationality of a society based on competitive exchange by establishing that the prices reached and the consequent allocation of resources are in some sense optimal. It is in this supposedly rigorous demonstration of the allocative efficiency of capitalist society that the originality of marginalism lies. If product prices correspond to marginal utilities, and marginal utility is a diminishing function of the supply of the product, then no reallocation of the products can achieve an increase in total utility. For the increase in utility, corresponding to the new use of any good, cannot be greater than the loss of utility corresponding to its old use. Likewise, if factor prices correspond to marginal productivities, and marginal productivity is a diminishing function of factor supply, then the relocation of factors can only reduce the total product, measured at current prices. And so, the utility, total utility. Thus, any intervention in the pricing or allocation of factors or products that disturbs the attainment of competitive equilibrium is bound to reduce, or at least cannot increase, total utility. The result is subject only to the qualification that the initial distribution of resources is given. Judgments about the equity of this distribution are outside the domain of economics. Thus, Jevons, quote, "So far as is consistent with the inequality of wealth in every community, all commodities are distributed by exchange so as to produce the maximum benefit," end quote. Jevons. Walras, the consequences of free competition, Walras, quote, "The consequences of free competition may be summed up as the attainment within certain limits of maximum utility," end quote. Walras. And Weiser, quote, "Where the general conditions are considered socially satisfactory and morally and legally correct, the general price is found also to be the just or equitable price," end quote. Weiser. Needless to say, this fundamental qualification, that the desirability of competitive allocation of resources was conditional on the desirability of their distribution was almost universally ignored by those who seized on marginalism as the basis for a new apologetic for capitalism. The marginalist theory of society. In economics textbooks, the marginalist revolution is usually described in terms of the technical innovations that made possible a more rigorous economic analysis. Economics is presented as the marginalists themselves presented it, as a natural science of the economic dimension of society, analyzing economic phenomenon in abstraction from any particular social or institutional arrangements. As such, economics is not about any particular society, and its laws can be considered to be applicable in consideration of any economic problem, which is defined as any problem concerned with the allocation of goods in conditions of scarcity. The problem, however, marginalism does not simply offer a theory of rational choice. The theory also purports to explain the rationality of the fundamental social relationships of capitalist society by deriving those institutions from the rationality of the individual, property, exchange, money, the division of labor, and the separation of the laborer from the means of production are all explained not as forms of historically specific social relations, but as technical instruments that facilitate the most perfect realization of individual rationality. It is only on this basis that marginalist economics abstracts the economic institutions of capitalist society from their social and historical context, reducing them to the rationally developed instruments appropriate to the optimum allocation of scarce resources. It can only make economics a natural science because it, quote, naturalizes the fundamental economic relationships of capitalist society. The starting point of the marginalist analysis is the isolated, utility-maximizing individual, endowed with given tastes, skills, and resources, and making rational decisions in conditions of scarcity. The analysis asks how this typical individual would behave on the assumption that the individual will seek to satisfy a, quote, desire for the most complete satisfaction of needs possible, end quote. Menger. At this level, the method of analysis is psychological, but it does not depend on any particular psychological theory, although it was originally formulated in terms of utilitarian psychology. A utilitarian psychology. The starting point is the, quote, practical consciousness of economic relations, end quote. Weiser. However, the method is not that of an intuitionist psychology, but of the deductive reconstruction of the behavior of a rational individual. Thus, the Austrians considered economics to be a branch not of psychology, but of praxeology, the science of rational action. The analysis implies no assumptions, either about how individuals actually behave or how individuals should behave. On the one hand, it is an abstract analysis considering the hypothetical consequences of rational economic action. On the other hand, the assumption that the individual seeks to maximize the satisfaction of needs implies no particular assumption about the content of those needs, which may as well be moral or aesthetic as material needs. The theory requires only that the individual should have a set of preferences and act consistently on those preferences. The elaboration of marginalist economic theory is an attempt to show that its essential results can be extended from the case of the isolated individual making subjective private decisions about the management of her scarce resources to the case of an exchange economy considered as a whole. The method generally adopted was to consider, firstly, the simple case of barter of two goods between two individuals, and then progressively to elaborate the model to include many individuals, many goods, money, the production of goods on the basis of fixed and then variable technical conditions, and of fixed and then variable factor supplies, to show that the essential results continue to hold throughout this elaboration on certain not unrealistic assumptions about technical conditions and the ordering of preferences. This extension of the analysis from the abstract and isolated individual to the exchange society depends on establishing the neutrality of the institutions of exchange by showing that the market provides the means by which individual preferences can be realized without imposing any external constraints on individual choice. In this sense, it depends on establishing that the market is a rational instrument through which human beings can achieve economic self-realization, rather than a social institution that structures particular social relations and subjects individuals to particular forms of constraint. This is achieved by establishing the formal rationality of the institutions of exchange. Many of the marginalists simply assumed the rationality of capitalist economic institutions. For the assumption of that rationality was an assumption that was one of the self-evident liberal truths handed down from classical political economy in all its variants. However, marginalism took up these truths when they had been thrown more fundamentally into question than at any time in the previous century. Socialists and reformers alike were no longer prepared to accept their self-evidence, let alone their sacred character. Thus, marginalism had to go much further than earlier versions of liberalism in attempting a rigorous and thoroughly secular demonstration of these truths, and indeed of their limits. It was the Austrians, and in particular Menger, who undertook this demonstration. Menger was insistent on the need to relate social institutions such as money, prices, and exchange back to their origins in individual action in order to establish their foundations in the natural and spontaneously evolved needs and aspirations of individuals. He was also quite explicit about his motives for doing this, for his invective was not directed at the conservative organicism of Burke and Savini, which he believed to be legitimate within limits, but at the relativistic approach of Schmoller and Schmoller's associates in the historical school, an approach that for Menger could only lead to socialism. Thus, his confrontation with what he considered to be the blind radicalism of Schmoller led Menger to formulate much more clearly than did his contemporaries the necessary foundation of marginalism in the radical distinction between the rational foundations of the economy and the social and institutional framework within which the economy operated, and correspondingly to offer a rationalistic and individualistic derivation of those foundations. Methodologically, Menger presented the issue as one of pure theory against singular explanation. But the substantive issue underlying this was the fundamental one. The possibility of a pure economic theory depended on the possibility of a rationalistic conception of economic relations, and this rationalistic conception could in turn set limits to the reformist ambitions of radicals and socialists. The institutions for which he had to account were the institutions of property, exchange, money, and capital. The first precondition for exchange is private property. Menger rejected the classical theory of private property, which saw the origins of private property in labor, and for very good reason, to offer instead a teleological explanation, which related the institution of private property to the rationality of the system of exchange which it underpinned. It is only the protection given by the institution of private property that can prevent the scarcity of goods in relation to human needs from giving rise to open conflict. Quote, "Thus human economy and property have a joint economic origin, since both have, as the ultimate reason for their existence, the fact that goods exist whose available quantities are smaller than the requirements for men. Property, therefore, like human economy, is not an arbitrary invention, but rather the only practically possible solution of the problem that is, in the nature of things, imposed on us by the disparity between requirements for and available quantities of all economic goods." End quote. Menger. The security of private property ensures the peaceful resolution of the problem of scarcity, which is the problem confronting any society. The economic problem facing the isolated individual is a relatively simple one, of employing her resources so as to attain the maximum possible degree of satisfaction. But this problem is not essentially altered when another individual is introduced with whom it is possible to exchange. Since each individual is free to exchange or not, the only significance of exchange is to increase the possibilities available, and so to make it possible to achieve a higher level of satisfaction. Thus, the institution of exchange is simply a further development of the rational attempt to maximize utility, spontaneously evolved by the action of self-interested individuals. Thus, Menger, after establishing that exchange is not an end in itself, concluded that, quote, "the effort to satisfy their needs as completely as possible is therefore the cause of all the phenomenon of economic life, which we designate with the word, quote, exchange," end quote. Menger. Within exchange, the marginalist analysis establishes that exchange ratios express nothing but the private evaluations of goods. Hence, in a perfectly competitive equilibrium, prices are determined without reference to any particular social or institutional context, representing merely a summation of individual evaluations. Money is no more a social institution in this sense, for money too arises spontaneously out of the individual attempt to maximize utility. The inconveniences of direct barter originally led some enterprising individual to attempt to achieve exchange through the mediation of a third good that was highly exchangeable. As others imitated the innovator, that good came to take on the character of money. Thus, money too had a rational origin as a technical instrument invented by individuals in order to perfect the process of utility maximization. Consideration of production did not fundamentally alter this model of society. Production was considered to be simply a technical means of transforming higher into lower order goods. The extension of the division of labor and the selection of technically and economically efficient methods of production emerged spontaneously out of the rational economic activity of individuals and brought both individual and social advance. With increasingly advanced methods of production, the division of labor affected the internal organization of production, as well as the relation between different branches of production. The rational allocation of productive resources depends on the mobility of factors of production between alternative uses, on their being the objects of independent evaluation, so that they can always be allocated to the most productive form of their employment. This depends on the existence of a free market for the factors of production, which depends in turn on the factors of production being independent from their owners as exchangeable commodities. In particular, the rational development of exchange and the division of labor leads to and depends on the separation of ownership of labor from ownership of the means of production. It is a matter of indifference who owns the different factors of production, and it may be that the same individuals own both labor and means of production, although the growing scale of production makes this increasingly unlikely. What matters is only that labor and the means of production are traded as commodities, so that their alternative uses can be subjected to rational evaluation. Thus, the separation of the laborer from the means of production was not the social foundation of capitalist exploitation. The separation of the laborer from the means of production was a necessary result of the development of economic rationality and a condition of its further advance. The completion of the development of economic rationality arrives with the emergence of credit, through which the ownership of the means of production is separated from their control. The efficient employment of the means of production requires scarce entrepreneurial skills, and so the ownership of the means of production will soon be concentrated in the hands of those who have such skills. However, the concentration of ownership would be a barrier to the further development of economic rationality, if it were not, in turn, subjected to the discipline of the market, since past success is no guarantee of future achievement, particularly if capital is transferred to other hands by, for example, inheritance. The institution of credit provided the mechanism by means of which this barrier is overcome, separating the employment of the means of production from the ownership of capital, so that capital can flow freely to capital's most profitable outlets. The system of money and exchange, of the division of labor, of private property, of wages, rent, and profit, the exchange values of goods and of productive factors to which they gave rise, were all rational and ultimately natural phenomenon, in the sense that they express nothing but human wants and technical constraints that could not be modified by any social intervention. Thus, for Walras, exchange value, quote, once established, partakes of the character of a natural phenomenon, natural in its origins, natural in its manifestations, and natural in essence, end quote. Walras. Oh. I just realized I've been pronouncing this guy's name wrong. It's not Visor, it's Wieser. Wieser determined the values derived by pure theory, quote, natural values, for the value of a good depended only on its scarcity relative to human desires. In the same way, the theoretical value of wages, rent, and profit depended only on the scarcity and technical productivity of the factors of production to which they corresponded in relation to the desirability of the goods they produce. Thus, for Jevons, profits and wages were determined by, quote, natural laws. However much marginalism defined itself in opposition to classical political economy, it represented much more a reformulation than a rejection of classical political economy. On the one hand, marginalism altered the basis on which capitalist society was evaluated, where classical political economy sought to establish the rationality of capitalist society on the basis of a theory of distribution and growth. Marginalism sought to do so on the basis of capitalism's allocative efficiency, viewing problems of growth simply as problems of allocation of resources over time. To this extent, classical political economy became merely a special case within the marginalist framework. On the other hand, marginalism made it possible to dispense with the classical theory of class by introducing techniques that made it possible to analyze factor prices independently of the ownership of those factors. Thus, marginalism was able to proclaim itself more scientific than classical political economy in attaining a higher degree of generality. Marginalism followed classical political economy in attributing revenues to owners of factors of production according to the, quote, Trinity formula. However, for classical political economy, the revenues that accrued to the owners of the different factors of production were each determined according to different principles, and this introduced a necessary differentiation of class interest into the heart of the model, thus giving rise to a class-based model of society. The marginalists found the asymmetry of treatment of the different factors of production one of the most unsatisfactory aspects of the classical theory. Formally, they argue that if economics was to make convincing claims to be a generalizing science, then it must be able to establish general principles that would govern the pricing of all goods, including the factors of production, without admitting of exceptions or introducing extra economic factors. Thus, for example, the distribution of ownership of the factors of production was of no more relevance to the determination of their value than it was in the case of finished goods. It was only the inadequacy of the classical theory of value that led the classical political economists to espouse exceptional theories for the value of the factors of production. The great merit of the marginal utility theory of value was that it could be applied with complete generality. The significance of the marginalist criticism of the classical theory of distribution was not simply methodological. Revenues, according to the marginalist theory, did not accrue to social classes. Revenues accrued to factors of production, and revenues accrued to factors of production according to the same general principles. Each factor, whether it was labor, capital, or land, received a reward corresponding to that factor's individual contribution to production and so to final utility. In this respect, there was no more qualitative difference between capital and labor than there was between different varieties of labor. Neither labor nor capital received their rewards as labor or as capital, but only as individual factors, making that factor's distinctive contribution. Hence, there was no need for any concept of class mediating between the individual and her revenue. In particular, the doctrine of the wages fund, according to which wages were determined by sharing out a fixed sum amongst the entire working class, had to be rejected. Although Bavinck resurrected it, the doctrine of the wages fund, in a revised form. On the one hand, there was no such fixed magnitude. On the other hand, labor was not homogeneous, so the wages of different categories of labor had to be determined independently of one another according to their contribution to production. In the same way, the idea of profits as a residual had to be rejected, for profits corresponded to the marginal productivity of capital and were equalized as capital was distributed among branches of production in order to equalize that marginal productivity. Quote, I conceive that the returns to capital and labor are independent of each other, end quote, wrote Jevons in criticizing the classical concept of the falling rate of profit. In eliminating the classical theory of class, marginalism finally completed the, quote, naturalization of capitalist society that classical political economy had begun by purging political economy of its residual historical content. The distributive shares of different members of society were no longer related to one another, but only to the contribution of each individual to production and of the product to final utility. Profit, rent, and wages accrued to capital. Land and labor, whoever happened to own those factors of production. For they corresponded simply to the marginal productivity of the appropriate factor of production. The theory said nothing about the original distribution of goods, and so said nothing about the person to whom the revenue would ultimately accrue. For this was clearly a matter that concerned the particular social and institutional arrangements of a particular society. In separating the analysis of the pricing of productive factors from consideration of distribution, economics could separate the analysis of capitalist economic relations from consideration of the distribution of wealth and power historically associated with those economic relations. For classical political economy and later for Marx, the two aspects of capitalist society were inseparably connected with one another. For marginalism, the relation between the two was a purely contingent historical relationship. Wages, rent, and profit were natural categories that simply expressed the scarcity of productive resources. Quote, the distribution of income and the apportioning of yields to the factors of production are two entirely distinct problems. End quote. Wieser. The radical separation of distribution from production and exchange removed the concept of class from the domain of economics to set economics on an uncompromisingly individualistic foundation. However, the removal of economics' social content from the field of economics simultaneously defined a space in which sociology could emerge as a complementary discipline. We have seen in the last chapter that the classical sociology of the 1800s arose out of a critique of the economic liberalism of classical political economy, whose laws define the proper economic, social, and political relations between the classes. However, in rejecting the, quote, dogma of self-interest, end quote, on which the classical economic laws were based, in favor of higher moral or political values, sociology simultaneously cut itself off from the liberal foundations of political economy in individual reason, and so could not provide any rigorous liberal alternative to the political economist analysis of class relations. The separation of distribution from production and exchange redefined the boundaries between economics and sociology, making it possible for sociology to accept the marginalist theory of production and exchange as an account of the, quote, economic relationship between the individual and nature, without thereby having to accept a particular theory of class and distribution, and associated theories of the proper constitutional and moral order of society. Thus, the marginalist revolution, in seeking to define the possibility and limits of social reform, simultaneously defined both the possibility and the limits of the complementary discipline of sociology, as the science which explored the comparative and historical variability of the moral and institutional framework of economic life. Facts and values in economic science. Marginalism claimed to offer a natural science of the economic dimension of society, analyzing economic phenomenon in abstraction from particular social or institutional arrangements, and so abstaining from making any judgments about the propriety of such arrangements. The laws that economics develops are natural or, quote, positive laws that neither imply nor impose any moral or political judgments. This claim to value neutrality on the part of marginalism would appear to be belied at once by the observation that the capitalist system, as presented by marginalism, was not simply a fact, but also an ideal. The free market system was claimed to represent the perfect self-realization of individual rationality in achieving the optimal allocation of resources on the basis of a given distribution of tastes, skills, and resources. The apparent paradox is resolved when we realize that the society of the marginalist described was not ideal because it corresponded to the evaluations of the theorist, but because it offered the most perfect expression of the preferences of the members of the society. The exchange economy was simply a rational instrument, a means through which individuals could seek to achieve their economic ends. It was the most perfect such instrument, in the sense that anything that could be achieved outside the market economy could be achieved more economically within the market economy, while it remained purely an instrument, so that it imposed no constraints on the ends that could be achieved through it. The marginalist model was formulated at a very high level of abstraction. The marginalist model did not describe capitalist society as it was. It described an idealized version of capitalism. On the one hand, the marginalist model was based on the ideal concepts of the rational economic actor, perfect competition, etc. On the other hand, it was an abstraction from the historical reality of capitalist society, which idealized reality in abstracting from all those features that disfigured the reality of capitalism and that offended liberal sensibilities. It was therefore not a theory that could be applied directly to the reality of capitalism, although its vulgarizers did so apply it for their apologetic purposes. The marginalists were well aware that their abstractions did not correspond directly with reality, and they did not seek to defend them as such. Thus Menger stressed that the pure theory rested on certain assumptions, including assumptions about perfect knowledge, perfect foresight, and an absence of constraint that did not necessarily apply in reality. In the real world, quote, real prices deviate more or less from economic ones, end quote. While the laws of economics were those, quote, holding for an analytically and abstractly conceived economic world, end quote. The pure theory offered an abstraction that represented an ideal world against which reality could be measured and against which proposed reforms could be evaluated. It is therefore no criticism of the marginalist analysis to note that reality does not correspond to its abstractions, insofar as the real world does not accord with the abstractions of marginalism. It is not the economic theory that is in error, but the real world that is in need of reform. The marginalist model provided a standard against which reality could be measured. As such, it provided a model that could theorize the possibilities of reform. Menger, Pareto, and J.B. Clarke were conservatives who stressed the virtues of capitalism and used marginalism primarily to berate and restrain overenthusiastic reformers. Others, such as Walras, Jevons, Wicksell, Wicksteed, Wieser, and Marshall, were reformists to some degree, recognizing the extent to which the reality of capitalism departed from the marginalist model. For these thinkers, marginalism provided a means not simply to defend capitalism, but to evaluate objectively the possibilities of reform. Thus, they recognized the harmful effects of monopoly in the real world and made proposals for the regulation or abolition of monopolies. They saw a need to improve the moral and material conditions of labor, proposing educational reforms to increase the productivity of labor and to give it a more civilized character. Some were even ready to contemplate the redistribution of wealth, especially through death duties and the taxation of landed wealth. However, the fundamental assumptions of the marginalist model set limits to even the most radical reforms which could be contemplated within its framework. Reform could only seek by one means or another to realize the ideal defined by the marginalist model. The rationality of the fundamental institutions and social relations of capitalist society could not be questioned, so that even the Fabians' quote, socialism, which drew on the new economics, could only conceive of socialism as a perfected capitalism. The marginalist model thus served to define clearly and precisely the limits of reform as well as reform's possibilities. The marginalist model is well able to accommodate the fact that reality diverges from the model. However, such divergences are considered to be contingent social and historical phenomenon and are not to be explained as inseparable aspects of the operation of the capitalist economic system. The divergences, therefore, are not the concern of the economist. Indeed, nevertheless, in recognizing the reality of the blemishes on the face of capitalism, marginalism recognizes the need for complementary disciplines to study the source of these divergences. For some economists, these complementary disciplines were considered to be empirical and historical disciplines that simply studied the specific institutional environments of different economies, particularly the specific patterns of distribution of property. In this respect, the work of the German historical school and the related schools of, quote, sociology already show their worth. However, other economists were more perceptive and saw the divergences between the marginalist model and capitalist reality could themselves have a systematic character, and so could be the subject matter of a rigorous sociology that did not simply attribute social evils to moral deficiencies or to the demon drink, or to problems of adjustment, or to cultural survivals from an earlier evolutionary stage. Modern sociology retained the idea, developed by its 19th century predecessors, that the defects of capitalism are specifically capitalist phenomena, arising out of the economic relations of capitalist society. But unlike its predecessors, it rejected the idea that such defects were inherent in capitalist economic relations. This modern sociology expressed a liberal conception of reform, according to which the task of social reform was not to create a new kind of society in which economic relations were subordinate to the moral and political order, but to perfect capitalism by ensuring that its reality corresponded to the marginalist ideal. The possibility of such a sociology was opened up by the self-conscious abstraction of marginalist economics, which abandoned the totalizing ambition of classical political economy. To mark out a space for the complementary discipline of sociology, the central subject matter of which should be the foundations, exercise, and abuse of power in society. Such a sociology would, like its predecessors, be critical of the economist model of liberal capitalism, in the sense that it would draw attention to the limits of the applicability of that model as an account of actually existing societies. But at the same time, unlike its predecessors, it would recognize the validity of that model within those limits. Economics established the, quote, formal rationality of capitalism as a system of provision for human needs. But it did so in abstraction from the, quote, substantive irrationality, which arose primarily from the abuse of inequalities of wealth and power. The central issue which confronted sociology was therefore that of the relationship between the, quote, formal rationality of capitalism and capitalism's, quote, substantive irrationality. On the one hand, if the substantive irrationality was a contingent feature of the institutional forms within which capitalism had developed historically, then institutional reform could remedy the defects of capitalism in order to realize its inherent rationality. In this sense, sociology would be a subordinate discipline to economics. On the one hand, if the substantive irrationality of capitalism was inherent in the institutional forms of capitalist economic relations, such as money competition, the division of labor, wage labor, the capitalist enterprise, then capitalism could not be reformed. And the distinction between the, quote, formal rationality and the, quote, substantive irrationality of capitalism, based on the radical separation of form and content, became untenable, which in turn threw into question the status of the distinction between economics and sociology as autonomous disciplines. At first sight, the separation of the formal rationality of capitalism from its substantive irrationality appears perfectly legitimate. The two aspects may have been inextricably linked in the past, but they can be distinguished analytically from one another. The rational model of the, quote, social economy, describing not so much the imperfect past of capitalism as capitalism's realizable future. However, what is at issue is not the plausibility of constructing an abstract model of a rational society, but the explanatory value of such an analytical construct. If the historical development and present operation of capitalist society was inseparable from its substantive irrational consequences, is it really plausible to argue that such consequences are contingent? Can the market, as a formally rational allocative mechanism, be legitimately detached from the social relations of class inequality and class exploitation with which it has always been associated? Or is inequality and exploitation inherent in the generalized rule of the market? Can the formal analysis of exchange be detached from consideration of the substantive content of exchange? Before turning to the rise of modern sociology, we clearly need to explore rather more closely the relationship between the rational and the irrational in marginalist economics.